sitting down.
Yes, thank you.
I was beginning to realize that the only way to make this evening bearable would be to ask Andre a few questions. Asking questions always relaxes me. I always enjoy finding out about people. Even if they're in absolute agony, I always find it very interesting. Finally, I got around to asking him what he'd been up to in the last few years.
God, I'm just dying to hear it. Really? Truly.
At first, he seemed a little reluctant to go into it. So I just kept asking. Finally, he started to answer.
Conference on para-theatrical work then.
How did you meet?
We met because I'd done a production of Alice in Wonderland for adults that was very successful. And Renata Adler, the writer and critic, called me up. She said she had a young writer friend who had seen it and loved it so much that he wanted to come every night, but he couldn't afford to do that. And anyway, there weren't any seats, you know, and I was so impressed. I put a seat in, special seat for Wally, and he came many, many times, and we never talked, because I always give notes to the actors after the show. And then about a year later, I'd been working on Ibsen's, on one of the Ibsen plays, Peer Gynt, and I wanted a contemporary American writer who could adapt it. And I called her and she said, what about Wally? I'd always thought he was a poet. I didn't realize he was a playwright. And he was in a hotel room in Iowa or somewhere because he could afford to live for about $12 a week. Mm-hmm. And I called him up, and I think it was as if the Messiah had, you know, because he never had a play produced. It was like a miraculous voice. And I said, I hear you're interested in writing plays. And he said, well, frankly, I have written about 12 of them. And he sent me his plays, and I started reading them. And it was that strange feeling where it's so personal to you that you think you've written it yourself. And I was walking around the house saying to my wife, listen to this, you know. And Wally, we rehearsed Peer Gynt for about a year while he watched the rehearsals. And then he went away and said, I'll come back when I've got the play. And he came back, I think, about a year later, and he had a 70-minute play that took place at a cocktail party in New York. So that was our Peer Gynt. We did it at the Public Theater, and that was how we began. You know, it's nearly 40 years of collaboration. Actually, the way this project originally came about was that I had a real need to tell my story before Wally got the idea. And I went to Bill Shawn, or I called him, and I said, you know, you're always doing these profiles on great artists. Have you ever thought of doing a profile of a failure? And he said, what a good idea. And because I considered myself a failure. I hadn't directed in a bunch of years. All I'd done was run around the Polish forest. You know, I really did feel my artistic life was definitely over. And Shawn, Mr. Shawn, put a very famous writer on my tail who writes mostly about, you know, people like de Kooning, artists. And then he got sidetracked and had to go do something that involved writing a book. So he was no longer telling my story. Of course, the odd thing is that in the years preceding this actual movie, from when I did these strange things, like going across the Sahara on a camel and everything, I would go to parties and I would tell these stories to entertain the people who were sitting on the table. And I think unconsciously, because I'm sure you feel this, don't you feel you're always working? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think I was rehearsing a movie, even though I never thought of a movie, you know. But
What, do you remember when you both decided to sort of turn your conversations into this script?
No, I think it was literally that I had told Wally many of these stories, and he got the idea. Just socially, yeah. And he got the idea and called me up, and That was it. And when he came up with the idea, I knew it would be funny because I could tell the difference between our voices. I thought could be very comedic. We may have been originally talking about talking heads for a television thing. I can't remember. But we knew we wanted to shoot it. And the one thing I absolutely knew for sure was that if we ever got it made, which was highly unlikely, that nobody except our friends and loved ones would go to see it. That was clear, you know. When Wally finished the script, we had this incredibly arrogant luncheon about who would direct this great work. You know, as if any director would want to direct a movie about two completely unknown people who sit and talk for 2 hours. And these aren't the real names, but, you know, we were literally saying, well, Kurosawa would be really very good, but I don't think he has a sense of humor, you know, and then we would say, Tarkovsky, maybe he's a little too abstract for, you know. We did take it to Mike Nichols, who couldn't do it. That was the only director that we could think of. And we just could not think of a director, and we were blocked. And years before that, I'd done this production of Alice in Wonderland in Paris, and it had been presented by Pierre Cardin, the great, what would you call him, clothing
designer.
Yeah. And as an opening night present, Cardin had given me a Cardin suit that made me look like a transsexual vampire. So I never wore this suit. I never put this suit on. And years later, Diana Mitchner, who's a very fine photographer, was over having tea, and she was telling me that she was doing a series about death, shootings, something, people, death. And I said, oh, you want to see Dead? And I put the suit on, and she said, oh, my God, you look terrifying. Would you come over to my studio sometime so I could shoot you, because you're just so deadly? And I went over, she did the shoot, and Wally, who was a good friend of hers, showed up with the script, and she asked if she could read the script. And a couple of days later, I get a call from a man with a French accent who says he's Louis Malle. I was sure it was a put-on because, you know, we told so many people we couldn't find a director for this. And he was literally in tears. He started sobbing on the phone. This is true. And he said, I think your script is so beautiful. I would like to direct it. If you don't think I'm the right director, I'll produce it. If you don't think I'm the right producer or the right director, the only thing I beg you is when you do the movie, there should not be anything visual in it. Keep to the concept of the two of you talking. And I started thinking, maybe this is Louis Malle. And he met us for dinner the next night, and Louis said to me, if I do this, he said to me, this is going to be the most difficult thing you've ever done in your life. And it was.
Did you know Wally was writing the script based on your conversations, or did he just start
yeah. No, we wrote it. We wrote it together in a very interesting way. We were lent a little room at NYU. We had a tape machine, and every day would begin with my telling Wally a story, and then, given my story, we would just start talking about anything. And I think the transcript, you'd have to check this out with Wally, I think it was something like 1,500 pages long, single space. And I think there were something like 80 major themes. And we chose our favorite themes, which of course cut down the amount of the script. And Wally took that, and then he made it into a 3-hour script, which Louis then helped us edit down into a 2-hour script. So it was really written by both of us. But that final stage, because Wally is a poet, could not have been done by anybody accept him because the script is very deceptive. For instance, if I talk about running around the Polish forest with the 40 women who played the trumpet of the harp, I would have said, in telling the story, I would have said, well, you know, we lived in this tiny little castle. We'd go out and do exercises during the day. We'd run around the forest. We'd eat at this great stone slab that served as a table. And then, you know, Wally takes that and he rewrites it into, we lived in a tiny little castle and ate around this great stone slab that served as a table. So what the audience sees in their minds is a tiny castle and a huge table. So you're into a hallucinogenic world that sounds completely real. And only Wally could have done that.
It's like Alice in Wonderland.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely.
Do you remember how long before you shot the movie that you were meeting at NYU? And
I think it was about 6 months at NYU. And then I think it took Wally about a year to take that. And then accidentally we found the director very quickly. And when Wally and I were rehearsing alone, because I'm a director, I'd make certain suggestions. I'd say, why don't we just run through the script today? We'd always run through the whole thing. And we could be gay lovers. Another day I would say we could be in Alcatraz together. We could be two prisoners, you know, so we were finding layer upon layer of the relationship of those two people. And then when Louis came in, that I think was about 9 months later, we got a small grant to be able to video, as if to get today one would need a grant for that, you know, to video the rehearsals. So that Louis, I think, was figuring out his shots as we did these rehearsals, because I'm sure he knew we'd have to shoot very fast. And he was teaching me to be a film actor, because I had trained to be a theater actor. And so, of course, my impulse always was to do more, you know. And in fact, one day I said to Louis, you know, in the Montauk burial scene, where I get buried alive, I said to him, I think there's much more stuff in there. He said, great, do it. You know, we'll shoot it. So I did it. And he said, how do you like it? I said, that's really good. He said, yeah, it might win a Tony, but it would never win an Oscar. That's not movie acting. So I didn't forget what your question was.
I do too, but
I will throw in one thing that Louis did give me. I think one specific direction during the rehearsals, other than literally training me as we watch this stuff. He said, speak faster. And I said, is that because I'm boring? And he said, no. He said, it's because you're a theater actor, or have been, because you have this impulse to want to act, you don't know how much the camera sees when it comes into your eyes. And he said it's the same direction that John Huston gave to his father, Walter, that got Walter the Oscar in Treasure of Sierra Madre. And Walter was also a theater actor. And that if you're talking faster, you won't be thinking. And of course, that was also very helpful because generally, as you've probably noticed, if I'm just talking, I'm relatively quiet, and I think soft-spoken, but it gave it that manic, feverish quality, so it was a great direction.
That feeling, I have to unload this.
Right, yeah.
By the time you were doing it for the camera, did it feel like you, Andre, telling these stories, or did you feel like you were playing somebody at that point?
Oh, I definitely felt I was playing somebody. The thing that drove me nuts, which is I think why Louis said this will be the most difficult thing you've ever done, is that I'm playing a character based on me. So then the question is, who am I? And which Andre? You know, because when I go to the gym with my trainer sees an Andre that my wife never sees. It's another person. So who the hell was he? And it was only when a long time into the rehearsal, I got the idea of 4 different voices. I actually use 4 different voices in the movie. One is Andre, the Peter Brook theater guru. The other voice is the Andre off-the-wall, spacey, dilettante, rich kid. The third is Andre, the spiritual used car salesman. And the fourth is the Andre when he's really being sincere, which is only much later in the movie. Once I had the 4 voices, my body started doing different things when the different voices were going. So it's an absolute character based on Andre Gregory, but it's not really Andre Gregory.
What is Andre's anticipation of the dinner?
What a good question. I would say probably, I'm not even sure if I thought of this, I would say probably he's lonely, right on the edge of going somewhat nuts, feels that he's a complete failure, and has this friend that he loves, and just has the need to unburden himself.
Yeah, that's what I was curious too. Was I was curious for you, the real Andre, and also the character. That are these. That was going to be my question: is how many times have these stories been told?
I don't think when we were actually shooting, I was a person who's told the story before. I think
This was the first
I
time.
created a character, and this was the first time, and this was the one person I could tell it to. And of course, there's in a way, the film is about men, because men tend to be so hidden, and Wally is hiding behind silence, and I'm hiding behind words. And the progress of the movie is that Wally is able to come out and start revealing, and I'm able to listen. And those, for us, are very radical actions as characters.
The movie itself, though, is also about friendship and about connection and about, in some ways, the pleasures of certain comforts of having someone to talk to connect with.
Yeah, it's the whole thing of conversation is interesting, because I think, while I'm pretty sure that Wally and I had talked about, as friends, about how we were living in a time by the 80s or the late 70s when nobody was really talking anymore in depth. It was all on the surface. It was all very superficial. And I think if I had one goal with this movie, it was to hopefully activate people to talk again. And of course, everybody reminisces about the wonderful days in college when they'd stay up all night, you know, but then they say, well, then we got into the real world. There was no time. We had children. I had a job. You just can't talk anymore. And when I listen, and when I go to restaurants now and I listen to the conversation around me, it's horrifying.
One thing I was curious about also, your character is telling so much about experience and what has just happened and how he feels and what where he's coming to, but the location of the movie in that fancy restaurant that seems kind of out of time in a funny way, and it also, because the movie starts so specifically in New York and feels almost captured Wally on the street. It's almost documentary style.
Right.
And then you come into this restaurant, which seems in New York, but not in New York. And I know you didn't shoot it in New York. I wanted to sort of, if you could talk about the decision to shoot there, and why that kind of restaurant, say, as opposed to just meeting at your home or at a diner or something.
Oh, well, that's an interesting question. First, as an experiment, which was my suggestion, I said to Louis, why don't we actually go to a restaurant and have a rehearsal in a restaurant? And we went to O'Neill's Balloon, so there could be actual eating, you know. And 15 minutes into the rehearsal, Louis says, eating will never work. You've got to set the movie somewhere else. It'll never work eating. I think just because, of course, I was talking and eating at the same time. In the movie, in fact, I think Wally probably ate 1,400 little squabs, and I hardly had a bite, you know. So we were devastated by this, you know. We went home and we thought about doing it on a train, doing it on a rock, you know.
The title changing, of course, with each
Of course.
Yeah.
Strangers on a train.
Yeah.
On the rocks. And we came to shoot where we shot. It's shot in Richmond, West Virginia, in one of the grand old Southern hotels. And this came about because Louis' assistant costume designer on Atlantic City came from a wealthy background. His father owned and bought this abandoned hotel in Richmond. And because it was December and there was no heating in the hotel, it would have cost a fortune to turn on the heating of the hotel. And of course we had heaters, but you had to turn off the heaters when you were actually shooting. So I was wearing long johns. I think I had an electric blanket on my lap, ironically enough.
Right, very ironic.
And in between takes, I'd go off stage and take a little swig of cognac, so it was freezing. But I am sure that Louis, who was involved with creating the set and choosing the extras, definitely wanted an area that, to create an atmosphere that was kind of not real but not real, which of course is what the whole movie is.
Right.
You know, so if you look at those guests at the beginning of the movie, they're some of the weirdest people you've ever seen in a restaurant. And of course the head waiter's a giant.
Yeah, he's very interesting, that waiter. It always feels like Wally is sort of has some kind of relationship. I mean, like the waiter is always getting to him in some way. He's always sort of, and I was thinking about the way. I mean, there's something about it's a lot of what you talk about in the movie too. Is involves class and. You know, talk about your doorman, and the waiter feels like that too. This sort of older man who's serving you, and you're in this. I mean, it almost has a Buñuel kind of feeling. That's sort of really luxurious plays.
The head waiter, that waiter, is an interesting story because I keep thinking I'm in My Dinner with Andre every time I tell you a story, because we couldn't find an actor for that, because we wanted somebody who looked as eccentric as me, as sort of to the manner born. The only problem is I can sit and talk about life, and he has to actually serve. And the problem with finding an older actor was that either they were famous older actors like Hume Cronin, or they were failures by the time they got into their 80s, or they were ill or something like that. And I called Richard Avedon, who was a friend because we'd done a book together, and he never forgot a face. And he said, I don't know if this guy is still alive, but there used to be a guy who worked in the archive department, the film department of MoMA, who has an amazing face if he's still around. And this guy, Jean Lenauer, actually had been one of the original international film distributors in Vienna before the Nazis. And then he had to come here. And of course, he could never do that again. And so he got this job eventually at MoMA. And movies had been his life, but he'd never been on a movie set. He distributed movies, and of course he hadn't done movies. He hadn't been in the movie business for years. And the first day of shooting, Louis wanted to fire him because, of course, he wasn't a waiter. So he didn't know what to do with, serving him. So Wally and I, who grew up on the Upper East Side, been to these restaurants, we stayed up all night with Jean, coaching him on being a waiter. He was amazing. In fact, Wally and I were coming from a rehearsal, I think of The Master Builder, a couple of years ago, and this guy ran up to Wally and said, "My Dinner with Andre, I've seen it 8 times. What an amazing movie. You were great. God, I love you." And Wally, after a while, said, "I suppose you know my friend." And he looked at me and he said, "I don't think so." And I said, "I was the other guy." And he said, "Oh." And he went back to talking with Wally and then shook his hands and went off down the street. And then he came running back and he grabbed my arm. He said, "I'm so sorry. You were the waiter. I didn't recognize you. You were great." So yeah, and it was very touching because Jean, as a result of the movie, this guy who was almost maybe a bit like a Kafka character, working in the basements of MoMA, what have you. He went out on the college circuit lecturing on My Dinner with Andre, and young women would be attracted to him, and so it gave him a whole other life.
That's great.
The other thing that's in the film that I know Louis understood, that critics didn't pick up on, is that people go right away to saying, "Oh, it's this weird movie about 2 guys talking. They just talk for the whole movie." But in fact, because we're storytellers, the movie is as big as Lawrence of Arabia or Cleopatra, because you go to Tibet, you go to the Polish forest. The interesting thing is that this person, that person, and that person see their own Tibet, their own Polish forest, so that in fact, in picturing that, in the fact that the movie isn't doing everything for you, it's activating the imagination of the audience. So it, in fact, if you like the movie, it's waking you up, which is one of the intentions of the movie.
It's a testament to how how cinematic words are and conversation is.
Yeah. Watching the Obama campaign or thinking about Churchill when it looked as if England would lose the war, or Martin Luther King, words are hugely powerful. And that's been forgotten, most especially in the movies. Where you have these 1 minute, 1 second shots, or, the power of the word and the ability of the word to activate people is a huge thing.
And the power of a talking head, a face.
When I asked Louis why he was so interested in Banya and doing Banya in My Dinner with Andre, he said, "I love the talkies." And he also once told me that, he'd been a deep-sea diver. Did you know that?
No.
He'd wanted to be a diver.
Well, I guess I did know that because he worked with Cousteau.
That's right. And then he came up too fast and burst his eardrums, so he had to give up diving, and that led to filmmaking. But he told me at some point that watching the human face is like watching amazing tropical fish, if you really just take the time to look at the face. And of course, Wally's face, because I've directed him now as an actor so many times, what I love about Wally as an actor is that many actors They give you one expression for one emotion. Wally's is like clouds going over the sun. It never, as you know him, it never stays the same for 4 seconds. It's an amazing face to watch.
Did you and Wally ever think about doing, I don't want to say
A follow-up?
Yeah, follow-up.
Well, you know, I did get an idea that I thought was very funny, which had Louis Malle lived, maybe would have happened. Because I think the idea of a sequence in general is horrible and can't be done. But I did get this idea. I thought if I got to be 85 and Wally got to be 75, it'd be great to have a movie where we were sitting in rocking chairs on the porch of a big Adirondacks hotel. And the entire movie, all we talked about was the one thing we never talked about in My Dinner with Andre: sex. I thought could have been a kind of sweet idea.
Of course, there's a problem because the closer you come, I think, to another human being, the more completely mysterious and unreachable that person becomes. I mean, you have to reach out, you have to go back and forth with them, and you have to relate, and yet you're relating to a ghost or something. I don't know, because we're ghosts, we're phantoms. Who are we?
At that time, let's say that was 69 or 70, and I was about 27. I had very strong feelings about theater, and I also had the feeling that I would be very influenced by anything that I saw. You know, I was a sad little person, but I really felt very defensive about my ideas of theater. And I was afraid of seeing productions because I thought they would harm me or something.
Mm-hmm. Well,
I'm sorry, that's the way I was. And so...
Because you would, it would turn you off of doing it yourself, or
No, I felt that I would be vulnerable and perhaps deflected from the true path that I was following by seeing certain things that might be too strong for me. I mean, I was afraid of everything anyway. I mean, in life, of practically everything. I mean, fear has played a big part in my life, and of course in My Dinner with Andre, it's all about fear. Mm-hmm. So Renata Adler called me and she said, this play, Alice in Wonderland, is incredible. You have to see it. The actors fly through space and they do unbelievable things. And I said, I don't want to see that. It's just not the type of theater I can accept. I'm against it and I don't want to see it. And Renata knew me very well, and she had read the plays that I'd written, and there were only a couple of people who liked my plays, and she was one of them. She said, no, but you really should see this because it's really amazing. And she mentioned it, you know, many times. So finally I said, well, all right, I mean, I guess I have to go to it. And so I went to it, and it really did, it was so astounding. This is the amazing thing about theater, and there, you know, you cannot describe it really, and you can't see it, even though there are videos of it and there are photographs of it. You really, you know, as, I mean, the cliche poetry is what is left out of the translation, and theater is what's left out of the photographs and even the video. Mm-hmm. It's just not, you can't describe it, but people involuntarily screamed during the play in the way that people do on a roller coaster. Uh-huh. was so terrifying and thrilling, and you thought the actors would be killed. It was like circus. And it was also the funniest thing you've ever seen in your life, and it was the most polished piece of theater that I'd ever seen. And then I went to see it a third time when they were doing it in Connecticut. And at that time, I brought Andre an envelope of my plays, which I did to everybody. I mean, I carried envelopes of my plays.
How many were there at that time?
Well, I'd probably written about 5 plays. I believed in myself as a playwright at that time. More than that, I really believed in myself. And I presented these plays to everybody. And no one in the professional theater liked them. No one. And no one out of the theater liked them except for a couple of people. But then Andre, I gave him the plays, but I didn't expect to ever hear from him any more than I heard from other people. And he called me several months later. I was staying in Cedar Falls, Iowa by myself, writing a play. And he called and said, I love your plays, and I want you to come work with my company.
By the time you did My Dinner with Andre, you knew each other quite well, right? I mean, or pretty well.
I would say we got to know each other really making the film.
What gave you the idea for the movie?
Well, because he had told me some of his experiences, and I had listened to him. Obviously, I was skeptical of some of his beliefs, but in daily life, I wouldn't have expressed that.
Mm-hmm. Even in the movie, your character, you say something like, do you really want to know? I'm really going to tell you what I think. Like, you even sort of wind up. It's like you prepare him for it. It's in some ways, I guess, acknowledging that it's not what people generally do.
Yeah, but it did seem like a very, very funny idea to me to just have the one guy who so passionately tried to make something of his life, and the other guy who was, I suppose, when we began, what seemed funny was that he was skeptical. As we continued the process, I suppose I was getting more and more into it and taking it more and more seriously and seeing that it was not skepticism so much as that he was very, very defended. He was defending himself. He was terrified by the things that his friend was saying. And then the film came to have a different meaning for me. But the original idea was that it was funny. Mm-hmm. And that somehow then there would be a third element, which would be the real world going on, while the two different types of bourgeois flaneur or whatever were chatting. Uh-huh. I mean, that maybe we would be walking and we would be passing people who were digging a ditch and working, or I don't know.
Mm-hmm. One of the many really interesting things about the movie for me is sort of the notion of what's conscious and what's unconscious.
I mean, first and foremost, what is not conscious and what is not said is that we're two upper-class guys spending hours talking about life while others are working and suffering and, so the most unconscious thing is our political environment.
Right.
I actually had a purpose as I was writing this, a personal goal I had a personal purpose in this. As it developed, it didn't begin that way, but as we worked on it, the filming of it, but particularly during the writing process, I wanted to destroy that guy that I played. To the extent that there was any of me there, that was the side of me that I wanted to get out of. Wanted to kill that side of myself by making the film, really. Because that guy is totally motivated by fear. And he's defending himself, and he's a very, well, he is the bourgeois human being.
Well, I thought it was interesting. I don't know how even conscious, or maybe I'm reading into it, but I feel like even as soon as he shows up, there's a shot of you where my reading of it is you seem actually happy to see him for a moment, but he's sort of and battling it out. But it also has, for me anyway, it provides a comfort in a funny way that because it's also about friendship and about conversation and about connection and tracking yourself through somebody else over time, and there is something there is this other current of real friendship and connection, even when you're not connecting.
Yeah, Louis had an affection for both of us, which enabled him to capture something that I would never have put in if it were me. Mm-hmm. And that made this, that warmed up this thing, in a way that it never would have been warmed up if I'd been the director. And I think that's partly why an enormous number of people have liked it. Uh-huh. And he captured things in me that I didn't know I was revealing. And I think he had a warmer view of life than I have. And it's partly why I can't watch the movie, because it does show things that, that he caught. So that it has a kind of, it's a little bit too heartbreaking. That's just how he saw life. I mean, his filmmaking was very, very affectionate, and in his daily life, he was a little ill at ease, I would have said. He was not capable of showing all of that warmth. But on the film set, wow, he was so affectionate, and he's a fantastic storyteller. There's a kind of logical, simple, sensible approach to his telling of a story. He has a great sense of humor, but he can also be serious, if that, because some of the film is serious, and we wanted someone who could also be serious. And we figured Louis would probably be, that his films had a kind of directness and simplicity.
In terms of the writing this, how was it different for you? I mean, had you done anything like this or done anything since like this where you were using real conversations?
For me, I was kind of sick of my own imagination. Mm-hmm. And very attracted to the idea of using real names, places, and dates. I mean, mm-hmm. I was excited about that. My own plays, only one of them takes place in any known place.
Right, yeah.
Most of them are just in an imaginary world. But anyway, yes, I I just loved the idea that we would, that it would be based in reality. So the process was, I suppose, at first discouraging because there was a very long time when I saw no a pattern or a story in there. But somehow, through a process of underlining or using different colors of pencils or God knows what, eventually certain themes began to emerge. Then it was an enjoyable process of trying to construct a fake conversation out. I mean, ideally, the goal, I suppose, was to make up nothing, and to make a fake conversation using only real fragments of conversation. In other words, months of conversation were cut up into minuscule scraps and glued together again in a sort of way that no one would notice.
Do you remember pieces that you couldn't use that you wanted to use, or?
Oh yes, I mean because we were taking it off the tapes. In a way, it's all kind of funny because the way people talk just is funny. If you actually transcribe it, and so that there was a lot that was kind of amusing, and it was actually. But the original script was, 3 hours long, and then with Louis and I mean the three of us, Andre, Louis, and I sat around a table for months and cut the 3 hours down to probably 2, and then Louis cut 15 minutes, I think, in the editing room, probably. With my okay. I mean, I was very, very difficult, and, let's be frank, he liked me, and he wanted to work with me again as an actor, but I don't think he looked forward to working with me again as a writer. It's sad, but I was very difficult because I would have made the 3-hour version. I would, and I am quite pedantic. Not the most interesting person. I'm quite pedantic, So I think I would explain at great length why every sentence could not be cut. Because it had the 4 different purposes in the script, and I think I would list all 4. I had a reason for doing the things that I did, and I would insist on explaining it. And he, of course, in other words, I'm a pitiful failure even today. And at the time, I'd never done anything that was even slightly successful. So he had no reason to even listen to me, and I had no standing to talk to him. But he treated me as if, I was, Harold Pinter or the most distinguished screenwriter. I mean, he never said, look, you're lucky that a guy like me is even talking to you. Don't you realize that? Don't you get it? I'm an internationally known filmmaker. You are an unsuccessful avant-garde playwright, and you're sitting here lecturing me about why I can't cut a line of your 3-hour script? He didn't ever say that,
But he was able to cut it down.
Well, yes, he won many arguments. He lost a few, and he won most of them.
Is it easier for you now to cut, or
Yes, I think I might have matured to some extent, although I don't think I'm the most fun person to work with or collaborate with. In a way, I don't even understand the concept very well. Sorry to say that. I hope you don't take it too seriously, although it's true.
do you feel, I mean, because of the success of the movie, and because you're playing somebody in the movie named Wally, and he's playing someone named, did you feel, was there a burden for you at all in terms of people assuming things about you or about Andre, or?
We're way remote from the people in the film. I mean, the characters and the Andre and Wally in real life were very seriously different, dramatically different, including the fact that for me, a lot of the things that I passionately proclaim in the film, I actually believed something quite different. In other words, the guy in the film is basically saying, I'll fight to the death to keep my bourgeois comforts and you know, and I mean, on 90% of the disagreements between Andre and me, I was sort of on his side. Not about the belief in the supernatural, which I never believed in, but you know, his attitude to life, I was more on his side, really. Not that I could live up to it necessarily, but I believed in it. I mean, to boringly describe my biography, we made the movie about sort of being asleep and waking up. Are you just kind of crawling through your life like a mole, looking at your feet? I don't know if moles do look at their feet, but not really observing what's going on in your own life or even allowing your own consciousness to take in anything. In my biography, it was a kind of political waking up that took place after we made the movie. I mean, I listened to the movie, followed the instruction of the movie, but it went in a different direction from what I would have imagined. In other words, I did go through a similar crisis in a certain way to the one Andre went through.
Which the fever is.
In a way, that play, The Fever, is a chronicle of it in a way, there's a big autobiographical element in that play, or really that's the only play of mine that has a kind of clear autobiographical element to it, but anyway, I like him, I became very agitated and went through a certain waking up process, but it was not really so much about my place in the universe as my place as a beneficiary of the American Empire.
That there is still this sense of history between people, and seeing, you know, where you were last time you saw them versus where you are now. And because Andre has gone through this very dramatic change, I think it highlights that.
Because I think Louis actually was celebrating being alive in the film in a way that somewhat fulfills in itself the quest that Andre is on. I mean, Andre is saying we're not aware of our own existence, and you know, in our town, Thornton Wilder is saying we're not appreciative enough of the fact that we exist. And Louis in the film is sort of showing, he's making a case for human life. There is something remarkable about friendship that I think it really is brought out in the film. Somehow we did, I think, form a bond in making the film that has kept us going, so that, you know, we're still working together. I don't know whether we would still be working together today if we'd only had the experience of that first play. In a way, it was a beginning of a process of forming an aesthetic that we, to some extent, built together. It began probably with that first play, but, well, I think as we worked on the film, our hyper-realistic aesthetic was coming into being, really. But I do think working on My Dinner with Andre, we were beginning to collaborate on a certain way of seeing things that then we've continued to make use of for whatever it's been, 30 years or something. 28, 29, 28, I don't know. It's been a long time since then.
How did you feel about the struggle for the movie to get an audience, in that it broke through and this became this kind of cultural thing? How that felt for you, or?
I think I did become a little more confident. I don't say necessarily swaggering or, you know, kicking people aside in the street, but a little more confident and pompous.
Did the experience change, say, how you wrote in the future or how you acted in the future, I guess?
Well, it was an amazing experience as an actor. It was just such an outrageous, you know, circus trick, really. I developed a certain confidence as an actor that I certainly had no reason to have before. I sort of thought, well, now not only am I a professional, I've done something that a lot of the professionals have not done. So I started taking myself a little bit more seriously as an actor. And, you know, sort of thought, hey, why aren't they giving me a better part, kind of thing. Now, when people come up to me and or in one way or another identify me as the guy who did that My Dinner with Andre, you know, there's a side of me that thinks, yes, it's, you know, the other things I did didn't make their mark. It's sort of sad. But basically, I feel, even though it was quite a while ago, doesn't seem long ago to me. It seems like about 5 minutes ago to me. So I'm gratified, because you totally couldn't predict, you know, many of the people who have really expressed enthusiasm for it. They responded to it as human beings, and that's wonderful.
When I finally came in, Debbie was home from work, and I told her everything about My Dinner with Andre.